Dobadura Airfield, New Guinea, February 1943. A young lieutenant named Richard Bong watches another P-38 limp back to the strip with its left boom shredded by cannon fire. The pilot climbs out shaking, unable to speak for a full minute. He had done everything right. Dove from altitude, lined up the shot, pulled the trigger. Then the Zero reversed, and his own fighter, the most advanced pursuit plane in the Army Air Force, felt like it was rolling through wet concrete. By the time the P-38 answered his hands, the Japanese fighter was already gone, already turning inside him, already lining up the killing shot. 37 American fighters had gone down the same way in 6 weeks. Not to better pilots, to a machine that could not turn as fast as the enemy it was built to destroy. The official doctrine was simple: never dogfight a Zero. Dive, shoot, run. Simple to say. Impossible to follow when the enemy forces the fight anyway. Somewhere between the cockpit and the tail boom, a fraction of a second was killing American pilots every single week, and nobody in Washington could explain why. The airstrip at Dobadura sat carved out of the New Guinea jungle like a wound that would not close. Steel matting laid over red mud, rows of P-38 Lightnings parked beneath camouflage netting, their twin booms catching the first gray light of morning. The air smelled of aviation fuel, wet earth, and something else that the ground crews had learned to recognize without naming it out loud. Fear, worn into the routine of another day. The jungle pressed in close on every side of the strip, a wall of green so thick it swallowed sound within 100 yards. At night, the insects screamed loud enough to drown out conversation. During the day, heat rose off the steel matting in visible waves, and men worked on the aircraft stripped to the waist, sweat running into their eyes, mosquito bites raised in welts on their arms. Malaria took almost as many men out of the fight as combat did. Nobody talked about that either. There was an unspoken rule at Dobadura, repeated in 100 small ways. You did not dwell on what could kill you. You focused on the engine in front of you, the belt of ammunition in your hands, the checklist taped inside the cockpit. Dwelling only slowed a man down, and in this theater, slow men did not last. By February 1943, the pilots of the 5th Air Force had learned to read a man's face when he climbed down from his cockpit. Some climbed down steady, already talking, already reaching for a cigarette. Others climbed down slow, hands trembling, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The difference was never about courage. It was about what had happened in the air, in the 2 or 3 seconds when a fight turned from a hunt into a chase, and the chaser became the chased. The P-38 Lightning was supposed to be the answer to everything the Japanese Zero represented. Designed by Kelly Johnson and Hall Hibbard at Lockheed in the years before the war, it was a strange-looking machine. Twin engines mounted in slender booms that ran back to twin tails, with the pilot seated alone in a central pod between them. Nothing else in the sky looked like it. Nothing else could do what it could do. It carried 4 50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon clustered in the nose, concentrated firepower that did not need to converge like wing-mounted guns on other fighters. It could climb faster than almost anything the Japanese had. It could dive faster too. At high altitude, where its turbo superchargers gave it power that thinning air stole from other engines, the P-38 was close to unbeatable. But war does not happen at the altitude where a machine is unbeatable. It happens where pilots are forced to fight, and in the skies over New Guinea, that meant low, fast, and close. The Zero was everything the Lightning was not. Built by Mitsubishi under Jiro Horikoshi, it sacrificed armor and self-sealing fuel tanks for lightness. A Zero weighed barely half of what a loaded P-38 weighed. It could turn inside almost any Allied fighter in the Pacific, snapping through a horizontal circle in a fraction of the time the heavier American plane needed. To an experienced Japanese pilot, a turning fight with a P-38 was not a risk. It was an invitation. The problem had a name among the pilots who lived through it, though nobody had written it into a training manual yet. Roll rate. Simple to say, impossible to ignore. At low speed, in the tight, twisting scramble of a dogfight, the P-38 needed real muscle on the control column to force its ailerons over, And even then, the big fighter answered a half-second slower than a pilot's instincts demanded. A half-second sounds like nothing. In the air, at 300 miles an hour, with an enemy fighter reversing direction 600 feet away, a half-second was the entire distance between a kill and a funeral. Pilots described it in different ways when they tried to put words to it back at the debriefing tent. Some said it felt like flying through syrup. Others said the stick simply went heavy in a turn, fighting back against their arms at the exact moment they needed the airplane to obey without hesitation. A few, the honest ones, admitted it felt like fear made physical, a mechanical stubbornness that turned every hard maneuver into a wrestling match against 40,000 pounds of aluminum and steel. The heavier the demand on the ailerons, the slower the wings answered, and the slower the wings answered, the longer a Zero had to finish its turn and bring its guns to bear. It was a problem of leverage and control forces that no amount of pilot skill could fully overcome. Strength helped, timing helped more, but no man's forearms could outmuscle physics at 300 miles an hour. By the time Lieutenant Richard Bong arrived in New Guinea that autumn, the 5th Air Force had already paid for that half-second many times over. Bong was 23 years old, a farm boy from Poplar, Wisconsin, quiet by nature, raised on hard winters and harder work. He had learned to fly at Luke Field in Arizona, where his instructors noted two things about him without contradiction. He was a naturally gifted pilot, and he could not resist pushing an airplane past the edge of what regulations allowed. That second trait had already followed him across an ocean. Before shipping out, Bong had been formally reprimanded by General George Kenny himself, commander of the 5th Air Force, for a stunt that had nearly gotten him grounded for good. Stationed briefly in California, Bong had looped his P-38 around the girders of the Golden Gate Bridge and flown low enough over a residential street in Los Angeles to blow the laundry off a woman's clothesline. Kenny did not send him home. Kenny needed pilots too badly for that, but he made it clear, in person, that the next violation would end differently. Bong listened, apologized, and privately decided that some rules existed for other people. It was a dangerous trait in a fighter pilot. It would also, in time, become the trait that let him survive when caution alone would have gotten him killed. New Guinea did not care about a man's confidence. On Bong's early missions, he learned the same lesson every green pilot in the theater was learning in blood. The official doctrine, hammered into every briefing, was simple to recite. Never turn with a zero. Use altitude. Use speed. Dive from above, fire one pass, and climb away before the Japanese fighter could bring its superior turn radius to bear. Boom and zoom, the pilots called it. Hit and run. The doctrine was sound in theory. It had been paid for in the wreckage of the Guadalcanal campaign and the early fighting over the Owen Stanley Range, where pilots who tried to dogfight Zeros on their own terms had gone down in numbers that made commanders rewrite the rulebook. But doctrine written on paper in a briefing tent was not the same thing as doctrine survivable at 12,000 feet, when a Japanese pilot refused to let you leave, reversing into your dive, cutting the angle, forcing the very turning fight you had been ordered never to accept. Bong felt it on his first real engagement, an interception north of Buna against a formation of Zeros escorting bombers. He dove from altitude exactly as briefed, picked a target, fired, and missed. The Zero broke hard. Bong rolled to follow, and for one long, sick moment, he felt his own fighter fighting him back, sluggish, heavy, arriving late to every command his hands gave it. By the time the P-38 answered, the Zero was gone, already reversing into a position to fire on him instead. Only his wingman's warning saved him that day. He broke off, climbed, and came home with no kills and a new, private understanding of what the other pilots meant when they talked about the delay. He was not alone. Squadron records from that autumn told the same story again and again. Pilots dove, fired, and tried to escape the counterattack, only to find their aircraft answering a beat too slow. Some walked away from it with a story and a lesson learned. Others did not walk away at all. In the 6 weeks before Bong's arrival, The 5th Air Force had lost dozens of P-38s over New Guinea and the Bismarck Sea, and while every official report cited pilot error, defensive maneuvering, or enemy numbers, the men on the flight line who worked on these machines every day whispered a different word: the airplane. Something about the airplane itself was working against the men who flew it, and no one yet had the authority or the evidence to say so out loud. General Guinea needed a solution, and he needed pilots disciplined enough to survive with the tools they already had, while Lockheed's engineers, 4,000 miles away in Burbank, wrestled with a fix that did not yet exist. His answer was to build a new kind of fighter group, one built entirely around the P-38 and entirely around the discipline the Doctrine demanded. In May 1943, the 475th Fighter Group was activated in New Guinea, staffed with some of the most promising young pilots in the theater. They called themselves Satan's Angels. Their mission was not to outfly the Zero. It was to outthink it, to fight a war of patience and positioning against an airplane that could outturn them every single time, and to do it without breaking, without the fatal half-second of hesitation that had already killed too many friends. Richard Bong was one of the pilots chosen to help lead that effort. He did not yet have a single confirmed kill worth mentioning in a letter home. He did not yet know that within a year his name would be spoken across the entire Army Air Force. All he knew, climbing into his cockpit morning after morning at Dobadura, was that the airplane beneath him was the finest fighter America had built, and that somewhere between his hands on the stick and the ailerons far out on the wings, something was still missing. Something that men were dying for every single week, while a war half a world away in a Lockheed test hangar had not yet caught up to the battle already being fought in the sky above New Guinea. The 475th Fighter Group came together in May 1943 at Amberley Field in Australia, before moving forward to Dobadura and later to Port Moresby, built from the ground up around a single airplane and a single purpose. Every pilot assigned to it flew the P-38. There was no mixing of aircraft types, no divided attention. General Guinea wanted a unit that could think in the machine's terms, that understood its strengths well enough to stop apologizing for its weaknesses. The pilots chose their own nickname before headquarters could assign them something forgettable. Satan's Angels, painted in bright letters on nose art up and down the flight line, a joke and a promise at the same time. Discipline was the entire philosophy. New pilots arriving at the group were drilled constantly on the same rule that had already cost so many lives to learn. Never turn with a zero. Not once. Not even when instinct screamed otherwise. Not even when a wingman was in trouble and every fiber of a man's training told him to snap around and fight. The tactic that worked, the only tactic that consistently worked, was patience. Climb high. Wait for position. Dive from altitude with the sun behind you if possible. Fire one disciplined burst. Keep the speed up and keep going, using the dive to carry you clear before the Zero could turn back and punish the mistake of staying. It was called the boom and zoom, and it asked pilots to fight against every reflex a dogfight seemed to demand. Guinea backed that discipline with an aggressive strategy of his own, one built to take the fight to the Japanese before they could bring it to him. In September 1943, the 5th Air Force struck the Japanese airfield complex at Wewak in a surprise low-level attack, catching hundreds of enemy aircraft parked in the open and destroying a substantial part of Japan's air strength in New Guinea in a single coordinated operation. P-38s flew top cover for the bombers that day, holding altitude, watching for the Zeros scrambling up too late and too disorganized to mount an effective defense. It was exactly the kind of engagement the Doctrine was built for, a fight fought entirely on American terms, at a time and altitude of American choosing. The success at Wewak did more than damage the enemy's strength. It proved, in a way that no memo from headquarters ever could, that patience and positioning were worth more than raw maneuverability, if pilots had the discipline to wait for the moment instead of forcing it. Richard Bong learned this discipline the hard way, the same way every pilot in the theater learned it, through near misses that left his hands shaking on the ground long after the engines had gone quiet. His first confirmed kill came in December 1942, a bomber shot down in a formation attack, methodical and unremarkable. It was the kills that came after, once he transferred into the operational rhythm of the campaign in 1943, that began to reveal what kind of pilot he actually was. He had the discipline the doctrine demanded and, underneath it, the same reckless confidence that had gotten him reprimanded back in California. The combination made him dangerous in exactly the way Kenny needed his pilots to be dangerous. Bong's own approach to that discipline had a signature almost every man in the group came to recognize. He preferred to close to remarkably short range before firing, sometimes inside 200 feet, well past the distance most pilots considered prudent, trading safety for certainty. It was a habit that unsettled some of the men who flew with him and impressed the rest, and it produced a striking number of kills confirmed not by a distant flash of smoke, but by wreckage close enough for Bong himself to have to bank hard to avoid flying through it. His commanders noted the same pattern the flight surgeons and gun camera analysts noted, that Bong rarely wasted ammunition on hopeful long-range bursts. He waited, closed the distance the doctrine allowed him to control, and fired only when a miss was nearly impossible. For actions flying escort and interception missions over the Huon Peninsula that autumn, he was awarded the Silver Star, official recognition of a growing reputation that had started, only a year earlier, with a young man being reprimanded for flying under a bridge. He was not fighting inferior opponents. The Imperial Japanese Navy still fielded some of the finest fighter pilots in the world during 1943, men who had honed their skills over China, over Pearl Harbor's aftermath, over Guadalcanal, and the long, grinding campaign for the Solomons. Among the most feared was Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, a naval aviator based for long stretches at Rabaul, credited by his own service with dozens of victories, and nicknamed, by the men who flew with him, the Devil. Pilots who tangled with airmen of that caliber and lived to describe it agreed on one thing. A Zero flown by a veteran like that did not make mistakes. It baited you, it waited, and it punished the smallest hesitation instantly and without mercy. The only defense was never to offer the opening at all. That was the entire logic behind the doctrine Kenny's pilots followed, and it explains why the fighting over New Guinea and New Britain through the middle of 1943 looked less like the swirling, romanticized dogfights of an earlier war and more like a series of ambushes, hit hard, disengage, return to altitude, and wait again. There was another factor working quietly in the Americans' favor throughout this period, one that had nothing to do with any single aircraft modification. Japan's Naval Air Service had entered the war with an extraordinarily skilled but numerically small corps of veteran fighter pilots, men who had trained for years before the fighting began. The brutal, grinding campaigns over Guadalcanal, the Solomons, and now New Guinea were killing those veterans faster than Japan's training pipeline could replace them with pilots of equal skill. Every experienced flyer lost, men of Nishizawa's caliber included, left a gap increasingly filled by replacements with a fraction of the flight hours and combat seasoning of the men they were replacing. American pilots, by contrast, benefited from a training and replacement system built for sustained attrition, one that kept feeding new pilots into squadrons like the 475th without ever hollowing out the core of experienced flight leaders. Discipline and doctrine were closing the gap the airplane itself could not yet close. The slow erosion of Japan's veteran pilot corps was closing it further still, invisibly, mission by mission, long before a single hydraulic line reached New Guinea. Neither Bong nor Maguire could fully escape the machine's limitations, though. Even flown with perfect discipline, the P-38's sluggish roll at low speed occasionally cost American pilots engagements they should have won cleanly. Combat reports through the summer of 1943 still noted incidents where a pilot lined up a shot, missed, and found himself briefly vulnerable during the recovery, unable to reverse direction as quickly as the situation demanded. Bong himself came home more than once with bullet holes stitched across a boom or a wing, evidence of a Zero that had gotten a fraction closer than it should have. The Doctrine reduced the danger. It did not eliminate it. The only real fix still lived 4,000 miles away, in a windowless engineering building in Burbank, California, where a different kind of war was being fought entirely, with slide rules, wind tunnel data, and the memory of men who had already died trying to solve the same problem. That memory had a name too. In November 1941, more than a year before Bong ever set foot in New Guinea, a Lockheed test pilot named Ralph Verdon had taken a P-38 into a high-speed test dive over California to gather data on a phenomenon nobody yet understood. As the aircraft accelerated past a critical speed, the air flowing over the wings began to compress and separate in ways that the engineers of the era had no vocabulary for. The tail buffeted violently. Control authority vanished. Verdon's aircraft broke apart in the dive, and he did not survive. The tragedy forced Kelly Johnson's design team to confront a problem that would come to be known, in the years afterward, as compressibility, the tendency of a fast aircraft approaching the speed of sound in a dive to lose elevator control entirely, tucking its nose down further no matter how hard a pilot pulled back on the column. Combat pilots in the Pacific who dove too steeply from very high altitude sometimes felt an early version of the same terrifying symptom, a heaviness in the controls that no amount of strength could overcome, followed by a nose-down tuck that ate altitude at a terrifying rate. Some pilots recovered as the aircraft slowed in thicker air lower down. Some did not have enough altitude left to wait for that recovery. Lockheed's chief test pilot in this period was Milo Burcham, a calm, exacting flyer who had spent years putting new Lockheed designs through their limits before the Army Air Force ever saw them. It fell to Burcham and a small circle of engineering test pilots to fly the dive profiles that gathered the compressibility data Kelly Johnson's team needed, easing an aircraft up past its safe operating limits again and again, recording buffet onset, control response, and recovery behavior at every increment, always aware of what had happened to Verdon and always aware that the next dive could produce the same result. It was unglamorous, repetitive, dangerous work, performed far from any headline, and it produced the raw numbers that eventually became engineering drawings, and then hydraulic lines, and then, much later, a fighter that could finally roll as fast as the enemy it was built to beat. Lockheed's engineers spent the better part of 2 years chasing two separate demons at once, the compressibility tuck that could kill a pilot in a dive and the sluggish aileron response that could kill him in a turn. Both problems traced back to the same root cause in different ways: the enormous aerodynamic forces acting on a heavy, high-speed airframe that had been designed before anyone fully understood what those speeds would do to a control surface. Kelly Johnson, already established as one of the most gifted aeronautical engineers in the country, drove the effort personally, aware that pilots on the other side of the world were paying in blood for every month the fix remained unfinished. Wind tunnel testing throughout 1943 slowly pointed toward two solutions that would eventually be combined into a single production package: a set of dive recovery flaps, mounted beneath the wing, that could be extended to break up the airflow separation and restore elevator control during a high-speed dive, and, more consequential for the daily grind of dogfighting, a hydraulically boosted aileron system, using engine-driven hydraulic pressure to multiply the pilot's control input at the wing, cutting the physical effort needed to force the ailerons over, and, just as important, cutting the delay between a pilot's intention and the aircraft's response. While the pilots fought and the engineers calculated, a third group of men kept the entire effort in the air, largely unnoticed and rarely thanked. The ground crews of the 5th Air Force worked in conditions that eroded aircraft almost as fast as combat did. New Guinea's humidity crept into every seam and fitting, corroding electrical contacts, swelling wooden components, breeding fungus inside instrument housings overnight. Sudden tropical downpours turned open-air maintenance into a race against the weather. Mechanics working under tarpaulins with flashlights clenched in their teeth, torque wrenches slipping in wet hands. Spare parts were chronically scarce that far forward, and crew chiefs became expert improvisers, cannibalizing wrecked airframes for salvageable components, coaxing worn engines through another dozen missions with patches and careful nursing that no manual anticipated. Every P-38 that took off from Dobodura or Port Moresby represented hours of unglamorous labor by men whose names rarely appeared in any citation, and whose only reward, most days, was watching the same aircraft come home in one piece. Word of the two rising aces spread through the 5th Air Force and beyond it, and with that word came pressure, official and unofficial, for Lockheed to finish what it had started. Kenny's staff forwarded combat reports directly to engineering liaisons, cataloging every incident where a pilot's account matched the symptoms the wind tunnel data had already predicted. The reports did not ask for miracles. They asked for the aircraft to do what its designers had always intended it to do: respond to the pilot's hands as quickly as the enemy responded to its own. Every week that passed without the fix reaching the front line was a week measured, quietly and without much public notice, in aircraft lost and young men who did not come home. McGuire's climb was steeper and louder. Born in New Jersey and raised partly in Florida, he arrived in the Pacific with a reputation among his instructors as a superb natural shot, the kind of pilot who could judge deflection angles almost instinctively, calculating in the space of a second how far ahead of a maneuvering target to aim so that bullets and airplane would occupy the same patch of sky at the same instant. Where Bong flew with quiet, almost mechanical patience, McGuire fought with an intensity that occasionally worried his squadron mates, pressing attacks closer than Doctrine strictly recommended, trusting his own reflexes and his marksman's eye to close the gap the airplane itself could not close. It worked, spectacularly, most of the time. On the missions when it did not work perfectly, McGuire came home with more battle damage than almost any other pilot in the group, testament to how thin the margin still was, even for the most talented aviators, flying an aircraft that could not yet turn as fast as the enemy it fought. Between Bong and McGuire there grew something the newspapers back home would later inflate into a rivalry, though the men themselves treated it more like an unspoken, friendly competition, the kind that develops naturally between two people doing the same dangerous job with the same rare talent for it. They flew in different squadrons, rarely on the same mission, and each man's total climbed independently, tracked by intelligence officers who logged every claim against gun camera film and wreckage reports. Kenny watched both scores with something close to paternal anxiety, aware that the American public back home had already begun to hunger for a single face to attach to the air war in the Pacific, and aware, more privately, that both young men were flying missions dangerous enough that either one of them could vanish from the tally sheet at any time. General Kenny was not a man inclined to wait patiently for solutions to travel through normal channels. Known throughout the Army Air Force for a willingness to bend supply regulations and chain of command protocol whenever it meant getting his airmen what they needed faster, Kenny pushed his own staff to keep direct pressure on Lockheed and on Army Air Force Materiel Command in Washington, forwarding loss statistics, combat reports, and pilot testimony as evidence that the fix could not wait for a peacetime testing schedule. He understood, better than most commanders far from the front, that every month of delay had a cost measured precisely in young men's lives, and he made certain that cost was never allowed to disappear quietly into a filing cabinet. His pressure did not invent the engineering solution any faster than physics and wind tunnel testing allowed, but it kept the project from slipping in institutional priority behind newer aircraft programs competing for the same engineers and the same production capacity. None of this arrived quickly enough to help the pilots fighting through the back half of 1943. Squadron after squadron kept flying the same aircraft with the same limitations, kept relying on discipline and the boom and zoom doctrine to offset what engineering had not yet delivered. Bong's score climbed steadily that autumn, methodical and unglamorous, each victory logged with the same careful notation: altitude, position, number of rounds fired, outcome confirmed. By the end of 1943, he had passed 20 confirmed victories, more than any other American pilot in any theater of the war, a fact that began to draw attention from war correspondents, looking for a hero to put in front of the American public. Bong disliked the attention. He answered questions from reporters the same way he had once answered General Kenny's reprimand, politely, briefly, and with an obvious wish to get back to the business of flying. The engineering path itself was not a straight line. Early proposals for boosting aileron control forces were tested and rejected for adding unacceptable weight or complexity, and the dive recovery flap concept went through several configurations before settling on a design simple enough to manufacture at scale without slowing production of an aircraft the entire Pacific and European theaters were both demanding in growing numbers. Every change had to be balanced against the reality that the P-38 was already in high demand on multiple fronts, and that any redesign risked delaying deliveries pilots were waiting for right now, in squadrons that could not afford to receive fewer aircraft while a better version was perfected. It was a tension without a clean resolution, solved in the end by pushing the improvements into a new production block rather than halting the line to retrofit existing airframes, allowing squadrons already in combat to keep receiving aircraft while the improved version worked its way toward the front through the normal replacement cycle. By the final weeks of 1943, the shape of the solution had been finalized in Burbank, tested, and approved for production. It would appear on the assembly line the following spring, integrated into a new production block that would carry both the hydraulic aileron boost and, eventually, the dive recovery flaps into squadron service for the first time. The men fighting in New Guinea did not know the details yet. They knew only that something new was coming, described in fragments passed along by pilots who had seen it during stateside training or heard about it from friends assigned to testing units. Second-hand rumors traded in the mess tent about an airplane that could roll like it weighed half as much, about a dive break that let a pilot pull out of a screaming descent without fighting a frozen control column. None of it had been confirmed by anyone who had actually flown the new variant in combat. It remained, through the last weeks of 1943, a story pilots told each other to get through the missions still being flown in the airplane they already had. For pilots like Bong and McGuire, who had spent more than a year mastering every trick discipline and tactics could offer, to compensate for an airplane that could not fully keep up with its enemy, the promise of a machine that finally could was almost too good to trust completely. They had learned, the hard way, not to expect solutions to arrive on schedule. They had learned to survive with what they had, one careful, disciplined mission at a time, while a war of engineers and wind tunnels quietly closed the distance between the airplane they flew and the airplane it was always meant to be. As 1943 closed out, both men stood among the highest-scoring American fighter pilots in any theater of the war, their names beginning to appear in newspapers back home, alongside cautious, heavily censored descriptions of what they had accomplished. Neither of them yet knew how the coming year would finally close the gap that had defined their entire combat careers so far, or what it would cost the two of them personally once the machine they flew finally became the machine they had always needed it to be. The first P-38J 25-LO models began reaching combat squadrons in the spring of 1944, and pilots who climbed into them for the first time described the same sensation in almost identical words. The stick felt light, not weak, not vague, simply obedient in a way the earlier aircraft had never been. Hydraulic pressure, drawn from the engines and routed through newly installed lines to bell cranks at each aileron, multiplied a pilot's input at the wing itself, cutting the physical effort required to force a hard bank down to a fraction of what it had been. A control movement that once demanded a pilot haul against the column with his whole arm now took a light push of 2 fingers. The airplane rolled into a turn almost the instant a pilot asked it to. The long, dreaded delay between hand and wing finally closed. Mounted beneath each wing, a set of dive recovery flaps gave pilots a second new tool entirely, a way to break the deadly compressibility tuck that had haunted the aircraft since Ralph Verdon's fatal test dive back in 1941, restoring elevator authority in a high-speed descent instead of leaving a pilot fighting a frozen control column all the way to the ground. Ground crews noticed the difference before most pilots ever said a word about it. The new hydraulic lines meant an additional item on every pre-flight checklist: fluid levels to monitor, fittings to inspect for the telltale sheen of a leak. One more system that could fail if it was not maintained with care. But the mechanics who had spent a year and a half watching pilots come home shaken, or not come home at all, understood immediately what the added complexity was buying. Word passed quickly down the flight line that the new aircraft handled differently, and men who had never flown a day in their lives found themselves listening intently whenever a pilot climbed down from one of the new J models and started describing, hands moving through the air to demonstrate, just how fast the airplane had answered him, in a turn that would have taken a full second longer only months before. The change showed up almost immediately in combat reports. Pilots who had spent a year and a half compensating for a sluggish airframe now found themselves able to do things the Doctrine had always forbidden, not because discipline no longer mattered, but because the airplane could finally back up the aggression its firepower had always promised. A Zero reversing its turn no longer guaranteed itself a clean escape or a clean shot. The P-38 could answer the reversal instantly, matching an opponent's direction change almost roll for roll, turning what had once been the Lightning's greatest weakness into, for the first time, a genuine advantage layered on top of its existing strengths in speed, firepower, and high-altitude performance. Richard Bong flew the improved aircraft through the middle months of 1944 as the 5th Air Force pushed its operations forward with the advancing front, from New Guinea toward the Philippines. His score, already the highest of any American pilot in any theater, kept climbing, each victory logged with the same careful, methodical notation he had used since his first confirmed kill in December 1942. By December 1944, he had reached 40 confirmed victories, more than any other American aviator of the entire war, a distinction that made him, officially and unofficially, America's ace of aces. General Kenny, unwilling to risk losing the country's most celebrated fighter pilot to a stray bullet or a bad piece of luck this late in the war, ordered Bong home before the fighting in the Pacific had finished, assigning him instead to gunnery instruction duties back in the United States. It was, in its own way, an order every bit as difficult for Bong to accept as any combat mission had been. He had built his entire identity and uniform around the men he flew beside and the airplane he had learned to master through hundreds of hours over some of the most contested airspace of the war. And being pulled from that world while the fighting continued left him restless in a way that friends and family noticed the moment he stepped off the transport plane back home. Bong received the Medal of Honor for his accumulated combat record, presented to him personally by General Douglas MacArthur, in a ceremony that the shy farm boy from Wisconsin endured with the same quiet discomfort he had always shown around public attention, more interested in returning to the cockpit than in the medal now hanging around his neck. Thomas Maguire's war ended differently and far more suddenly. Flying with the 475th Fighter Group over the Philippines in early January 1945, Maguire led a flight of P-38s on a mission near Los Negros when his formation was engaged by Japanese fighters at low altitude. One of his wingmen came under attack, and Maguire, true to the same aggressive instinct that had built his extraordinary combat record, rolled hard to come to his aid. He had 38 confirmed victories at that point, second only to Bong in the entire Army Air Force, and by that stage of the war he was flying with external fuel tanks still attached, extra weight and drag that most pilots would have dropped before entering a maneuvering fight. At low speed, low altitude, and with that added weight, his aircraft stalled during the turn. There was no altitude left to recover. Maguire's P-38 crashed into the jungle below, and he was killed instantly. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the citation recognizing not a single moment of recklessness, but an entire career built on exactly the aggressive, split-second decision-making that had made him one of the finest fighter pilots in the American arsenal, and that had, in the end, been the thing that killed him. It was a bitter irony that the technical fix so many men had died waiting for arrived in time to help him win nearly all of his victories and still could not save him from the one danger no hydraulic line could fully engineer away: a pilot's own willingness to turn back into a fight to save a friend. The airplane that had once been the problem had become, by the last year of the war, one of the finest fighters in the Pacific theater, respected in equal measure by the American pilots who flew it and by the Japanese airmen, who now had to face a P-38 that could finally outroll them in a turn, as well as outclimb and outdive them at altitude. The technical achievement belonged to no single person. It belonged to Kelly Johnson and the engineers who had spent 2 years turning combat reports and wind tunnel data into hydraulic lines and sheet metal. It belonged to test pilots like Milo Burcham, who flew the dangerous evaluation flights that made the fix possible, and who did not live to see the war's end himself, killed in October 1944 testing an early jet fighter for the same company. It belonged to the ground crews across New Guinea who kept aging airframes flying through heat, rain, and chronic shortages long enough for the improved models to finally reach the front. And it belonged in the end to men like Richard Bong and Thomas Maguire, who had spent more than a year proving that discipline and courage could compensate for a machine's shortcomings, buying the time that engineering needed to catch up to the war already being fought in the sky. Richard Bong did not get the peaceful ending his survival through combat seemed to promise. Assigned to Lockheed as a test pilot after returning from the Pacific, he was killed on August 6, 1945, when the P-80 Shooting Star jet fighter he was flying suffered an engine failure on takeoff from Burbank, the same airfield where Lockheed's engineers had spent years solving the problems that once threatened to define his entire war. He was 30 years old. His death was reported on the same day the United States dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, a coincidence of timing that meant America's highest-scoring fighter pilot of the Second World War received barely a fraction of the public mourning his record might otherwise have commanded. He was buried in his hometown of Poplar, Wisconsin, not far from the fields where he had first learned, as a boy, to watch the sky. He had survived more than 200 combat missions against some of the most skilled fighter pilots Japan had, only to lose his life at home, in peacetime, in an aircraft that had never fired a shot in anger, a final, quiet reminder that the danger these men faced had never come only from the enemy. The story of the P-38 Lightning in the Pacific was never, in the end, a story about a single clever trick or a single stroke of genius solving an impossible problem overnight. It was a story about a machine with a genuine, dangerous flaw, about a doctrine built by cautious men trying to keep pilots alive with the tools they actually had, and about an engineering fix that took 2 full years of testing, failure, and quiet, unglamorous persistence to finally deliver. It cost test pilots their lives in the process. It cost combat pilots theirs while they waited. And when the fix finally arrived, it did not erase the danger of war. It simply gave brave men one fewer disadvantage to overcome, in a fight that still demanded everything they had to give. Richard Bong and Thomas Maguire remain to this day the 2 highest-scoring American fighter pilots in the nation's history, 2 names inseparable from the airplane that very nearly failed the men who flew it, and that ultimately, through the patient, unglamorous work of engineers and test pilots half a world away from the fighting, became one of the greatest fighters of the entire war. Their combined record still stands unmatched more than 80 years later, a testament not to a single miraculous fix, but to what disciplined men could accomplish even before that fix ever arrived.